I want to bring in two former representatives. We have Democrat Donna Edwards, now an MSNBC political analyst, and Republican Charlie Dent. Good to see you both. So, Charlie, after the debate, you wrote Democrats must replace Biden as the nominee. Has anything changed in your mind since then? The interview last night, perhaps, did that do anything to quell your concerns?
No, nothing has actually changed my mind. I thought the interview really didn't do a whole lot of damage to President Biden, but I don't think it helped him too much either. Look, this election is about the next 4 years. It's not about the last 4 years. And, you know, I've been talking to a lot of just normal people. I got to tell you, I haven't run into anybody who said, boy, I'm really excited about Joe Biden. I think he ought to run again. They're either saying he should not run or that they're very deeply concerned about his condition. It's pretty obvious to me. I think there's just too much talk going on in Washington among insiders trying to, you know, delude themselves that everything is okay, when in fact it's not okay. You know, I've been saying for a long time, maybe before this debate occurred, that much of the American public thought that one candidate was too old and the other too dangerous. And now they're starting to say they think one's incapable and one's unimaginable. And they're really alarmed by this choice, as are leaders around the world. But normal people are just not having the same reaction as a lot of these insiders. So I'd say that Biden would do himself and the country a great service by stepping aside, take a bow, and, you know, rest on your achievements. He even made a comment the other day about he needed more rest and not work as long. That's a good argument for retirement. That's not a good argument for being the president, which is a 24/7 job.
Yeah, well, look, if you listen to him, though, he's not going anywhere. And speaking of the insiders, I want to get into that with you, Donna, because in this interview, Biden spoke about his conversations with Democratic leaders in Congress. Take a listen.
And if Chuck Schumer and Hakeem Jeffries and Nancy Pelosi come down and say, we're worried that if you stay in the race, we're going to lose the House and the Senate, how will you respond?
I go into detail with them. I've spoken to all of them in detail, including Jim Clyburn. Every one of them. They all said I should stay in the race. Stay in the race. None of the people said I should leave.
But if they do?
Well, it's like, they're not going to do that.
So, look, because of his experience in the Senate, we know that the president values the opinion of lawmakers. But do you believe, Donna, no one is having these hard conversations with him other than George Stephanopoulos? I mean, would he listen if they did?
Well, I think, look, the president has a record, multi-decades of public service. He always looks out in the public interest and not in his own self-interest. And so I think there are many Democrats, frankly, who are taking the president at his word, that he's taking stock of what people are saying and that he is moving forward. I don't know who Charlie's talking to, but the Democrats that I'm talking to, ordinary people, actually think the president should stay in this race, and that despite the polling and otherwise, that he offers the best chance to defeat Donald Trump, who many people believe is an existential threat to the democracy. And so I think the president has been reaching out to lawmakers. Many of them, they all come back into town next week, and I'm sure reporters are going to be chasing everybody around the hill, trying to figure out what they think. But at the end of the day, this is Joe Biden's decision, and I think there are many of us who trust the president to make the right decision. And while I don't think that the interview last night is a be-all, end-all, there are going to be multiple opportunities over the next several days and few weeks for the president to demonstrate that he's up for the task of tackling the job for the next 4 years.
So, Charlie, I want to ask you your opinion on this and comment on what Donna said with regard to those that are or are not talking to President Biden and having these hard conversations. Do you think he's getting them?
That he's having hard conversations? I can't say. I hope he is. I really hope he is. But look, you're seeing more Democrats come out in Congress right now. I saw Mike Quigley and Mark Warner and others, you know, making some pretty strong statements. I mean, a lot of people feel like they've been deceived. You know, we've been told that everything is fine. He's at the top of his game. Well, he's clearly not at the top of his game, and he's having challenges. And frankly, many in that White House have been pretty aggressive with people who called into question some of his statements and that he was not as quick as he used to be. They've been very aggressive about this. And that Robert Hur, when he said that Biden was an elderly gentleman with a faulty memory, I mean, they excoriated that man. I think they have to be a lot more transparent. I'd like to hear from a physician or a neurologist. Hell, my daughter's a neurologist. I talked to her. But I'm just saying that I'd like to hear from somebody other than just people who are shilling for him. I just feel like I've been hearing a lot of spin these last few months, and they got to do better than what they're doing now.
Look, this all may be a moot point in a couple of weeks because there certainly is a clock ticking as to when this has to be decided, Donna. But can Biden win this race? And if he steps aside, and again, that's a big if, he claims he's not going to, but there's time to see if he ultimately does. If he were to do that and back Vice President Harris, does that have to be now?
Look, I think that obviously the clock is ticking to the Democratic convention that's coming up, and obviously to the election that's coming up in November. I actually believe that the president can still win this race against Donald Trump. I do think that it's a climb. It was going to be a climb before the debate. It is a steep climb now. And I don't want to speculate about what the president may or may not do or the vice president may or may not do. But obviously, the clock is ticking. And I think it's going to be incumbent on President Biden to demonstrate over these next days and weeks that he's up for the task. I think that he can do that. But, time is ticking.
OK, but to that end, Charlie, no president since Ronald Reagan has given fewer interviews than Joe Biden. Does this president need to increase his visibility and build confidence, or do the risks outweigh the rewards?
Well, it certainly seems like President Biden has been protected by his staff. As you pointed out, he's done very few press conferences, very few unscripted interviews. He's going to have to really ramp this up if he hopes to salvage his campaign. I agree with Donna. I think there's still a chance that he can win. I mean, I think it's much less of a chance. I'm not here to tell you, who's going to win or who's going to lose in this election. But if the Constitution is truly under threat, and if the international order and people's rights are at risk, I think, Democrats should be really wise, to put somebody on the stage who can make the argument. And Joe Biden wasn't able to do that against his nemesis the other night. It was clear he couldn't do it. And I don't think this is going to get better. I mean, these situations tend not to get better with time. They tend to get worse. And so, they can tell us whatever they want to tell us. But again, a lot of people are out here watching this. 50 million people watched that debate. Many millions more have watched the analysis and the worst moments of that debate. And it's going to be really hard to persuade them that what they saw was that you're going to change their minds. They saw it. They're not going to unsee it or unhear it.
Yeah. In terms of putting people out there to make the case for him, Donna, the Biden campaign has outlined a travel blitz this month, and that includes visits to every battleground state between Biden, Harris, the First Lady, and the Second Gentleman. What can those others that I just named do to improve the outlook for Joe Biden?
Look, I think it's all hands on deck. And I mean, clearly the president's team has laid out a schedule over this next month a schedule that's going to have the president out in the battleground states, doing interviews in those unscripted moments that everybody is clamoring for, and his allies and supporters around him and surrogates going out across the country as well. This is a real opportunity for the president, and I think he's going to take advantage of it.
Okay, what about the down ballot races, Charlie? Because even before the debate, Democrats running for Senate, other races, they were out polling Biden. So if voters decide to stay home on Election Day, how damaging could that be to Democrats across the board?
Well, it's obvious to me that those the Democratic members in these battleground districts are panicking. I've talked to some. They know that Joe Biden can drag them down. If there's a collapse at the top of the ticket, I mean, particularly in the Senate races, I mean, if you're John Tester, Sherrod Brown, Bob Casey, and some of the others, in these tough states, and also members in tough House districts, they have to be concerned if the president collapses in those districts. This is going to have real consequences. And so the Senate is already at great risk for the Democrats. It's likely Republicans win that. The House, who knows right now? So at some point, you'd think Hakeem Jeffries and Chuck Schumer might be the ones making the call to the president about the severity of this situation and what's truly at risk. Because I can assure you these battleground members are enormously concerned about what's happening at the top.
Yeah.
Hey there, MSNBC fans. I'm Luke Russert, and be sure to join me, Rachel Maddow, Jen Psaki, Lawrence O'Donnell, Steve Kornacki, Joy Reid, and many more September 7th in Brooklyn, MSNBC Live Democracy 2024. Click on the link for ticket information. We will see you there.